All right, good morning, class. We're going to take a look at World History, Chapter 14, Section 2, Guided Notes. And you're going to need to find that section before we can begin. Follow along and please fill in what you need to fill in. So, we're going to take a look at questions 1 and 2. As a result of the Crusades, trade for the most part kind of started opening up to Europe. And to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about the Italian connection here. Italian cities of Venice, Genoa. If you're in Nebraska, we call it Genoa, but if you're in Europe, it's Genoa. Florence and Pisa, which you might recall, Leaning Towers are there, and also the city of Milan. Cities also in towns in northern Germany belong to the Hanseatic League. All of these communities, were connected by water for the most part and allowed trade to kind of flourish in those different places. Italian merchants began trading in locations around the Mediterranean Sea. So, trading with the Greeks, trading with the Holy Land, trading with parts of Egypt, and so on. Um, for the most part, was very, very easy to do because of the accessibility by sea. Take a look at numbers 3 and 4. The Venetians, the people of Venice, were able to build a strong trade network by utilizing warships, traveling to the Byzantine Empire and Muslim lands to bring back goods to Europe. Some of the goods that Europeans were starting to covet, spices. You gotta understand, food in Europe before this period of time was pretty bland. I think most of you probably can appreciate the use of salt, maybe even some pepper, but those kind of things were not necessarily always accessible. So, if you can imagine what meat would taste like without seasoning on it, yeah, that's kind of what the meals tasted like. So, if you were wealthy and you could get those spices, you could kind of, you know, jazz up your food for the most part. Along with that, we would have some trade fairs. A lot of times, your trade fairs would center around monasteries or church. Today, we like to call them bazaars. If you think about it, maybe in terms of our parish and the bazaar that it has, that's a tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages within Europe. Not to say that we want to tap that far back in our history and our community, but certainly this is a tie that really kind of stretches back to Europe. Trade fairs were held usually near towns or monasteries. These fairs were able to attract large crowds, and it was a great opportunity for people to do some shopping that they wouldn't have been able to do before. People would travel long distances in order to shop a large variety of goods. Sometimes these fairs would last for months. Think about it maybe in terms of like I don't know if any of you have been to like a flea market or something like that. It's kind of similar to that, where you would have lots of peddlers, lots of different tables and goods to go through. And, if they're going to be around for a while, you might be able to get a bargain at some point in time. All right, numbers 5 and 6. To increase the use of currency and credit, um, we had actually the creation of a whole new occupation sect. Um, And by using currency and credit, eventually it's going to lead to the creation of what we call a bank and the occupation of a banker. Used to be that if you were a merchant and you were making, a lot of trades with people, you might kind of start extending trade like currency or credit with people. Um, but at some point in time, we're going to actually take those merchants and they're going to like set up a whole new industry of just banking. And a lot of that comes out of places like Italy. And eventually it's going to spread throughout all of Europe and eventually it's going to spread to other parts of the world. When you talk about agriculture, there were some advancements that happened here. The use of the heavy plow. Plows, for the most part, which I think many of you are familiar with, they back in the old days probably needed to be harnessed up to some type of animal, be it an oxen or perhaps maybe a mule of some type to be able to be pulled. Plows back in the Middle Ages. Not necessarily as nice as the plows that you would have found during the 19th century here in the Americas. You think about like the McCormick Deere plow, or the original John Deere plow. That was made out of steel, and there's an advantage to using steel over iron, which iron is basically the material that you would make this heavy plow in the Middle Ages out of. And it has a lot to do with how the dirt goes through or is pushed away by the plow itself. Iron has a tendency to collect the dirt. And so at some point in time, you're going to have to probably kick the dirt away from the plow. Whereas a steel plow, for some reason, doesn't collect the dirt as much. And for the most part, is a little easier to handle for the person who's operating it. So a plow is great, but at some point in time, that's going to be improved upon. When you talk about collared harnesses in the illustration that we have here, this is an example of that. Those of you who have ever been around, individuals who like to collect like tack and stuff like that, this is very common equipment that you would see here in the United States, in the 19th centuries and before. Um, for the most part, this is going to become the standard tool until we get into the mechanized age when we start seeing the use of tractors. And again, the three field system, which we've already talked about, again, this is going to make your land a little more productive. The key here is you got to have enough land to be able to set some of it aside and to do the rotation. All right, 7, 8, and 9. With increased food production, fewer people were needed to work on farms, and thus we kind of have a whole new situation arising where we're going to become a little more urbanized. Some people were able to move to the cities. And by moving into the cities, we're going to start, moving away from an agrarian society. And eventually, at some point in time, we're going to start kind of working our way to a more industrialized society. Now, it's going to take a few years, a few centuries for that to happen, but we're starting to see the beginnings of this kind of towards the end of the Middle Ages. Okay, by the end of the Middle Ages, merchants received charters from kings, and these charters allowed merchants, for the most part, to run certain towns. So you didn't necessarily need to be a king or a queen, but if you had a charter to kind of establish a city, then you could be a merchant who becomes like a mayor and be in charge of this group of people who are living in this city, and eventually maybe start writing laws and such. The main function of a guild, and I just want you to understand, guilds are very similar to what we would call like a union today. But a guild was to protect a group of merchants from outside competition. Okay, and they would regulate the work of an artisan. Artisan is somebody who's a very skilled um, individual. Artisan kind of crafts would be like, for the most part, working with wood, maybe being a cobbler, being able to work with leather and wood to make shoes, blacksmithing. Those are very skilled jobs, masonry work, being able to build. We needed to have some way to regulate that quality of work. And so that way, if somebody wants to be, a carpenter or a mason, they would have to have a certain skill set before they could start calling themselves a carpenter or a mason. We don't want them building things that are going to, fall in on people. All right, going on. The last part here. Guild systems had many advantages. For the most part, the craftsmen could set their standards. They could also set the prices for their products. So if everybody who is a carpenter are setting their prices together, you won't have one person like undercutting all the others. And so everybody's rate is going to be very similar, and so you wouldn't have to worry about somebody, manipulating the system so that they get all the business and eventually make all the money. Guild members would personally supervise the training and guard the trade secrets of their occupation. So if we were talking about masons who were mixing, concretes and things like that, maybe even making the bricks to build some of these buildings, they would know the formula, but it would be something that they wouldn't necessarily share. It's kind of like a coveted recipe, that maybe your mom or your grandmother has. You wouldn't want them, bragging about it and sharing it with everybody so everyone, has this knowledge. But what you would want to do is to kind of keep it, you know, under wraps so that way you can kind of call it your own. All right. Medieval cities were very unpleasant. A lot of it had to do with the lack of sunlight. got to remember the way we were building structures at this period of time. The walls were very thick, and there was really a limited use of windows. And part of that was glass was very expensive. If you were a kind of a peasant, you probably wouldn't be able to afford that. Okay, and thus things got hot, kind of unsanitary as a result of that. You also had crowded streets, lots of trash, waste. This is before we have standardized sewer systems. This is before we have garbage collecting. And so when people would, you know, use their bedpans, they would literally just throw them out, you know, out into the streets. And that creates waste. Okay, nasty waste. Not only human waste, but you got to also remember we're living in an age, you know, where we were using a lot of livestock. They produce a lot of waste too, and there's not a system to remove that. So if you're living in town and you're using, you know, like horses and oxen to help move things about, who's going to be going up and cleaning after those animals? There was no system to do that, and if you did, you were probably the poorest of the poor, just looking for any kind of work. Maybe you would be in charge of doing that. As a result, there was a lot of vermin. Okay, we're talking rats for the most part. And as a result, if you have rats, you're probably going to have disease. And along with that, you had people who were thieves. What's interesting is the rate of murder. You know, a lot of people say cities today are very, very dangerous. But the truth is, cities back in the Middle Ages were probably far more dangerous. You had a lot of murder. And the fact is, you didn't have police systems. You know, when we talk about modern policing, that is a really modern kind of thing. Cities like New York and Chicago, really you can go back to right after the American Civil War, and that's when they started their first police departments and fire departments. Before that period of time, it was a lot of vigilantes, you know, justice by the people who live in that area. And if nobody wants to take justice in their hands, you're going to have a free for all, a lot of chaos, and as a result, you're going to have murder. Okay, cities did provide people a place to socialize. There was a lot of entertainment. I think all of you at some point in time probably have read Shakespeare, and you probably know a little bit about theater and around and such. So I mean, you could go to the theater and you could see those kind of things. You could probably hear music at some point in time. Sports, not necessarily in the sense of what we have today, but there were opportunities to see jousting and you know, kind of those medieval activities that would have been kind of exciting to watch back in the day. All right, thank you very much. Make sure that you have it all completed.